Mason. Anyone back there? Thank you. Welcome to our adult Bible class. Connie and I were away last week. We were up in a place called Oregon, Ohio, where we were staying. We went, we got it now. Thanks. Anyway, we were staying up there doing a week of birding, and I wish you could have been with us. We saw thousands of birds, particularly warblers. You know anything about them, but they're very colorful. It strengthens your belief in the Creator, seeing all those different things. All right, we're going to jump right into our study, and I may even use birds as an illustration here in a moment. But I know we began a look at the fact that Satan. Background for those of you who haven't been here. We are having a study on, basically it's for new converts, to strengthen some very elementary things. And we've been talking about Satan and his nature. And 2 weeks ago, I began a topic that Satan sets snares for us. He knows us so well that he actually sets traps for us. We often think of Satan as this mystical figure, as I've mentioned in the past, red suit. He's got this forked tails and horns, and, it's hee-hee, ha-ha. Satan made me do it. Let me tell you something. If you will study the Bible intently, and you look, and I thought of Paul in particular, because so much of the New Testament Paul penned, and we get a glimpse of how he viewed Satan. He didn't view him as some mystical figure. He didn't, it's not something that our children might watch on TV. No, he was very real and very active and very dangerous. And the statement is made in 1 Timothy chapter 3, verse 7. I'm sure I read this to you, but I want to go back and kind of build on this a little bit more. In 1 Timothy chapter 3, verse 7, notice what Paul says here. Speaking of the eldership, he said, moreover, the man must have a good report of them which are without. And then he says this, lest he fall into reproach and the snare of the devil. If you look up the word snare, you'll find Thayer says it's this, a trap, a noose, of snares in which birds are entangled and caught. A snare, that is whatever brings peril, loss, destruction, of a sudden and unexpected deadly peril. He goes on to say it's used of the allurements and seductions of sin. But all those different things. And I mentioned last week, Jared, he is trapped a little bit, not a great deal. But you think about what Satan must know if he's going to set a snare for us.
Actually, it's a live trap.
All right? But you have to know something about your quarry if you're going to set a trap. For instance, I don't know, if you were going to, let's say that Bill Crumley said he was, used to attend here, those of you who knew him, said he was born, too late in life. He would have been better off being born a generation or two in the reverse. But if you were maybe living in, Colorado, or you're one of the frontiersmen and you're out investigating this land, you might have trapped a beaver. Would you set a beaver trap out in the middle of up on top of the mountain, away from water? Would you do that? How many beaver would you catch? No water around, you're up here on top of the mountain. How many beaver would you catch? None. Why? Yeah, it's not their habitat. And that's right. Yeah. So Satan has to know so many things about us. I put this in my notes here. To set a snare effectively, one must know first the habits, the characteristics, the weaknesses, the patterns of the prey. If you're going to try to trap a beaver, then what the trappers do, they try to get it in a certain way, and usually it's in some type of a funnel, not out in the middle of this pond, in the middle of nothing, but they get it in some place that, oh, here's a trail where beaver have been using. And they put this, knowing the characteristics, knowing the habits, they would set this trap in such a way that they could catch this beaver. Now that may be appalling to you, but that's what Satan does for us. And a little bit later, we're going to look even more detail that Satan knows me as an individual. I'm different than Bobby. I've got a lot more weight than Bobby. I'm shorter than Bobby. My interest, we just came back from a trip where we were looking at all these beautiful birds, and there in the swamp, they're just, you can almost reach out and touch them. And at times they flew by, and if I'd been quick enough, I could have caught one. Bobby doesn't have the interest I have there. He enjoys cruises, other things, and we are different. And all of us are. From our eating habits to where we live to what we enjoy doing. But if Satan is going to know us so intently that he's going to set a snare, a trap for David Irick, he's got to know something about me. Now, that's frightening. And that is our foe. And we should never downplay the fact that, that Satan is some mystical cartoon-like character. No, we have a foe. And Paul, later I'll show you where he even talks about the fact that he says, Satan hindered me. Let's turn and read that here, and I'll look at a couple of scriptures with you. 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 18. And if you want to follow along with me, you can. If not, I'll look this up if I can get this going here. 1 Thessalonians, that is again, chapter 2, verse 18. Here's what Paul said. He says, wherefore we would have come unto you, even I, Paul, once and again, but Satan hindered us. Do we ever view problems in life that way? And I'm not saying everything is Satan, okay? I don't believe Paul viewed it that way. But Paul, being inspired of God, I know that we have the Old Testament book form. He didn't have it like we have. I know we have the New Testament, Matthew to Revelation, in a way he didn't have it. He was just being pinned. But you've got to remember, one of the gifts was that of knowledge. I'm confident Paul would have had that knowledge. He was inspired. And what I'm trying to communicate to you, realize he had a knowledge of Satan that I don't know that we fully grasp. But here he says, I would have come unto you, I wanted to come to you once and again, but Satan hindered us. He didn't say the pitfalls of life, well, I have a flat tire. No, I know he didn't have cars, but you get the point. Well, one of the children became sick and I had to spend extra money, and well, the refrigerator, freezer, washer, and dryer went out and I had to spend some money. I didn't have enough to come. I don't know that I view those as Satan, and I don't think I should. All right? But yet, Paul said, I wanted to come to you, but Satan hindered. Now, how do you think Satan could have hindered Paul today?
Lots of different ways.
Any opposition to what his cause.
Persecution. Read the book of Acts, and you'll see, and as a matter of fact, we're going to turn to 2 Corinthians in just a minute, and how Paul lists all the problems that he's had, being scourged, being whipped, this happened, stoned, pardon? Shipwreck. We'll read all those in a minute. But he believes Satan was behind those things, and certainly the persecution, which I think was a big thing that no one can doubt. But he realized that Satan is behind anything that's going to bring success to my life. And I'm not talking about financial. I'm talking about success in the sense of me living faithfully to my God and his laws. Satan is opponent to that. And temptations, we need to realize, and I'm jumping over some of my other things here that I'll talk about later, but where Paul says, neither give place to Satan, neither give him a chance. And I can do that so often by the places I go. Can I put myself in a position, a place that I shouldn't be in? Absolutely. And especially a time of a point of weakness. If I've got a problem with addictions, drugs, alcohol, whatever, should I put myself in a position where, I'm going to eat down here at the local bar and most of the seats out here are filled, so I'll just, step up, excuse me, and I'm going to eat on the bar, and, where alcohol's being served right around me, and I so want one, and somebody says, here, have a beer, have a shot of whatever, of some type of alcohol. Should I put myself in that position if I've got a problem with that? Neither give place to the devil, Paul says. But here he says Satan hindered us. And he said that more than once. Bobby, do you care to look up Romans 1:13 just for a moment? And the rest of us can turn to 2 Corinthians 11:23. And I'll show you where Paul had talked about here the problems that he had encountered. 2 Corinthians 11:23. Bob, you've got Romans 1:13. Do you care to read it?
And I will not have you, brethren, but oftentimes I purpose to come unto you, but was not let hitherto, that I might have some fault among you also, even as among the other Gentiles.
Okay, in the text, he's reading the King James Version, where it says, I was let not hitherto. Now, it's just not the way we typically word things, but the word let in the English there, L-E-T, if you look that up in the Greek language, it meant to hinder. I was hindered. I wanted to come, but I was hindered. We have a foe that in essence is standing in our way so often, placing things, yes, I believe, in our past as we go throughout life. Knowing me as an individual that he can set that trap, set that snare. I go back to my illustration. You're not going to set a beaver trap out in the middle of the highway out here and never expect to catch a beaver. I've got to go to their habitat. And once you learn something about birds, if you have an interest, last week we saw hundreds of prothonotary warblers. If you don't know what that is, maybe I don't know. Lance, you're down around where there's a lot of prothonotary warblers. You probably never had an interest to see one. Let me just pull this bird up and I'll show you this. I don't know if you can see it or not. Okay? You'll only find that bird, unless it's migrating, flying, you'll only find that bird around swampy areas. So if I went to see a prothonotary warbler, I've got to go where there's water. The only place around here that I'm aware of that they're ever seen is Little Oak Campground, where we camped not too long ago. What? Yeah, Jacobs Creek. There's a place where sometimes you can catch them along the lake there, down in the bottom. But if you go up in the mountains, you're not going to see one. I just mean they have every animal, every species have different habitats and different characteristics. Satan knows those things about us, and that's why it's so dangerous.
Well, David, a Christian, new Christian, obviously should know these things, what they're about to get into, and how Satan works. But even as a mature Christian, we still battle with this.
Yes.
A lot of anger issues that I had in my past as young, before I became a Christian, I still deal with today. Yesterday, for example, I was working on my car, a 66 Chevy Nova that I have, and I was welding in the floorboard, caught the car on fire. Well, that set me off. I mean, I've been working on it for 2 days, and here I was doing this, but it was my own fault. I mean, all come down to it. I can't say Satan, the devil made me do it.
Right.
It's the characteristics that I'm holding on to that made me react the way that I react. I shouldn't react that way, but I did. But I'm saying it's not only new Christians, but it's a lifelong battle. Paul said, I buffet my body daily and bring it to like he wars with it, you know, every day, every single day.
Finish this quote. Wherefore let him that standeth take heed lest he fall. Who is he talking to, new converts there? I don't think so. So we can all fail. And it is something that, and Bob, thank you for bringing that up. It's not just something, this isn't just for new converts. All right, I mentioned 2 Corinthians 11:23. Listen to Paul, and we talk about how he may have been hindered. Are they ministers of Christ? I speak as a fool, I am more. 2 Corinthians 11:23. In labors more abundant, in stripes above measure, in prisons more frequent, in deaths oft. Of the Jews 5 times received I 40 stripes, save one. Thrice was I beaten with rods, once was I stoned, thrice I suffered shipwreck, a night and a day I've been in the deep, in journeys often, in perils of waters, in perils of robbers, in perils by mine own countrymen, in perils by the heathen, in perils in the city, in perils in the wilderness, in perils in the sea, in perils among false brethren, in weariness and painfulness, in watchings often, in hunger and thirst, in fastings often, in cold and nakedness. And sometimes I, look at my life and say, this just isn't going the way I wanted. What about Paul? But you think about the fact, back in verse 23, in stripes above measure, do we ever stop and reflect upon exactly what that was, to be scourged? It's one thing to have someone look across the table from us and say, I just think Christianity is silly, or you're silly to believe in that, or I don't believe that nonsense, or I don't want to talk to you again. We have some of those statements made toward us. It may hurt our feelings. But you think about, here was Paul, when they gave them in these stripes, these scourgings, realize they took off the clothing, he would have been stretched, the back would have been stretched forward, I described this to you before, and then would have lictors, individuals, that would have had, typically, they would have had wooden handles, let's say a foot long, or perhaps a little shorter, and they would have these leather strips tied to that, and the other end, they would often have, they would take some type of a bead or a bone or something like a vertebrae of a small animal, and they would thread that on that leather, having a knot on one here, they would thread it on, tie another knot on the other end to keep it in place, and maybe a stone that they had hollowed out a hole in, they would thread that through that, tie it in, tie a knot on each end, and then individuals to your side following through when they would hit your back, and as they would follow through, it would cut into the flesh. 40 stripes save one? How painful that had to have been.
He's beaten near death.
And many people believe that Jesus, after going through his scourgings, which had to have been the most severe, from loss of blood and other things, many people believe that's why he couldn't bear the cross later when it was placed upon him, as they took him to where they were crucified. But here he says, in stripes above measure. How many of us? Okay, David. Let's talk about David. I can tell you what David would do. You talk about being depressed and woe is me and this is not right and it's not fair and, but yet he continued on. And he saw these things as they were the fruits of Satan. And I think he had to have been right. Of the Jews, 5 times, verse 24, received I 40 stripes 5 times? Not 5 licks, as we would call it. No. 5 different occasions that happened. 40 stripes save one. I can't imagine that. I'd be calling uncle, raising the white flag. I've had enough. I want to quit. He didn't. Thrice was I beaten with rods. And of course the shipwrecks. And he talks about the perils in verse 26 of robbers, perils of his own countrymen. And yet he viewed that Satan is hindering me. So, once more, Satan is a terrible enemy that we all face, and we don't think of it more so in this cartoon character. One of the places, since you're here in 2 Corinthians with me, turn over to the next chapter, chapter 12, verse 7. And lest I should be exalted above measure, Paul says, through the abundance of the revelations, there was given to me a thorn in the flesh, the messenger of Satan, to buffet me, lest I should be exalted above measure. Next verse says he prayed 3 times that it might depart. Paul was in the flesh. He had this thorn. I don't know what it was. Some people said it was eyesight. He had written in one of the other epistles. You see how large a letter I had written unto you. It wasn't large because it wore me out writing. I mean, I've just written for days. That's not the concept. Many people believe it had to do with the letter. You see how large letter. And if you see me, I picked up Linda's bulletin back there, and I had that arm's length. Yep, I think that's what it says. Well, if I'm going to write today without glasses, I must write in large letters where I can see them. I don't know if it was eyesight, if it was some physical pain. I don't know. But he said it's a thorn in the flesh. But he said he viewed it as the messenger of Satan to buffet me. Now, the word buffet, this is what Paul used now. This is the Greek word he used when he says the messenger of Satan to buffet me. The word buffet means to rap with the fist. Don't know, hopefully it was when you were young. But if you ever got in a fight, Darrell was always much older, much stronger than I was, and I was very much a coward. I guess when we had some confrontation, I would hit him as hard as I could with my fist, and the only advantage I had over him, I was faster. So I would flee, I would run for my life after doing so. But it says to strike with the fist, and I'm reading Thayer's definition, to give one blow with the fist. And that's how he said, Satan, the messenger of Satan, to buffet me. It was like being hit with a fist. That's how he viewed it. And he attributed that to the work of Satan. Now, come to find out, was it Satan? Or at least God was working through this occasion.
You look at the fall of man in the garden, and you start to decay, and all elements start coming. I was thinking about this, and I think about how healthy I am and what I enjoy in life, and I oftentimes take it for granted, and you get lax because you're not suffering anything. But then you see other people with certain ailments that's really debilitating and painful, and they're more humble people. But those things come about. All of our ailments come about because of Satan and man in the garden. Satan is the author of this. He's the author of pain, all that anguish, all that death.
The fact that,
the messenger.
yeah, we were talking earlier, I was with someone about growing older and all the problems came about. Who was promised death? The day you eat thereof, you shall surely die. And we've talked about death came into being. Paul in the book of Revelation, talked about death came in, the world by one man. And of course, life also came about by one man, that of Christ. But inevitably, it is of sin, of Satan, okay, which brings about these issues. But all I'm trying to show you is that, listen, that Paul viewed this as the messenger of Satan to buffet me, to bring me down, to cause me difficulty. So we need to realize it's a real foe that we're all faced with. And again, my problems may not be your problems. I thank God that I have had the health, had the mentality, had the ability to go out to work and to labor. Now, as we go into retirement years, we have a house, not perfect. It's nice, it's adequate to keep us warm in the winter, cool in the summer. It keeps the rain off our heads. I think of the transportation that we have. I'm blessed, and I thank God for all that. So that's not my issue. But you take someone else outside of my shoes, it may be they don't have the shelter. They don't have something to call their own. They don't have it. It's concern about, well, if the landlord says tomorrow, I'm going to burn the sell the house, whatever. You're leaving. Where are you going to go? I don't know. Well, see, I don't have those issues and all the difficulties that would associate with that come about as a real concern. But then there's other things that I may face in life with my health, as I've said. Most sins in some broad setting probably occur, at least many people believe they occur, in one of three categories. John said, for all that's in the world, the lust of the eyes, lust of the flesh, the pride of life. And most people believe that sin, again, in some broad spectrum, fits in one of those categories. Never being, the lust of the eyes, never being satisfied, always wanting. There's a better garment out there. There's a newer pair of shoes. There's a newer car. There's a newer golf cart. Whatever. There's newer golf clubs, newer fishing poles, newer guns, newer, I want. I'm never happy. I'm always looking. I'm never, ever, content. And there is the lust of the flesh. And I don't know that I have to go into all of that. Certainly that has to do with sexuality, and anything that would be associated with it, which is broad, and pride. So many of us fall into the category, I did this, and we want to lift ourselves up to other people. We want other people to think higher of ourselves than maybe they ought. But pride keeps us from saying, I'm sorry, I was wrong. Pride keeps us from, you can go on. But, again, Satan works through those things to bring about our demise. All right, I've rambled and rambled. Your thoughts on this before we go to the next other section here?
Tom just talked about timing. He said, you be in good health and good everything, and all of a sudden you get sick and you don't know how to deal with it, and then you get weak in your faith because a lot of people get mad at God. I mentioned
That's
before, they get mad. Why did that happen to me? Or why did that happen to my family? Or my child or something. And then they quit the church after being members of the church forever. It makes you wonder what they really understand about life when that happens. But it happens. I heard from Tom a lot of stuff.
Yeah, I just talked to a gentleman last night whom I've known many, many years, considered a friend. But he said, did you know that I had breast cancer? He's a man. Men do have breast cancer, not certainly as often as women. But he went through surgery back in February, chemo, radiation, whatever, I don't know, trying to build his strength back. We all have those issues. He could easily say, why me? No. Of all the men I know, of all my male friends, I'm the only one that has breast cancer. Life was never promised us without difficulties. All right. Anything else before we go to the next section here? Still on temptation. Okay. In my outline that I've typed up here, Satan can attack us in areas or in periods of weakness. Turn to Matthew chapter 4 with me. I think we have a classic example here of where Satan is at work tempting Jesus. Matthew chapter 4, we'll start with verse 1. And a lot of these things you have the disadvantage of having someone who's attended here for decades, and it seems like I never say anything new, but as we go through the scriptures, we're looking at the same book. I'll show you what I'm talking about in just a moment. Matthew chapter 4, verse 1 beginning. Then was Jesus led up of the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted of the devil. And when he had fasted, speaking of Jesus, had fasted 40 days and 40 nights, he was afterward an hungered. I don't know if you've ever fasted. Some people have fasted for religious purposes, which if you do it for the right purpose, I think can be very beneficial. Some people have done it to lose weight. I've talked to some people who say, well, I fast today and I eat tomorrow, and maybe 2 days and I fast. Whatever. But the fast is to refrain from eating. Well, here it says, Jesus had fasted 40 days. Now, what would be your physical condition if you fasted 40 days? You went 40 days without food. What would your physical condition be? Starving. Would you be weak? Would it, I'm sorry, would it affect you mentally? It would. Here is a weakened character. And by character, I don't mean that derivatives. What's wrong? I don't mean it bad. Okay. He had to be in a weakened, hungered state. And yet, what Satan, knowing this, what's the very first temptation that Satan throws his way? Well, read it. You got it, Bob. Let's read it. And verse 3, and when the tempter came to him, he said, if thou be the Son of God, command that these stones be made bread. Food. Aren't you hungry? It's the very first thing he tempted him with, knowing his weakened state, knowing his body needed food, and that's the very first temptation he provides to him. So, again, that just says so much about Satan having an understanding of us, our needs and our weaknesses. And that's the first thing he mentions. So, we've got to be careful. He goes on to tempt him in other ways, in the sense of pride. He takes him up to the top of this pinnacle where he could see, and in essence, I'll give you all this, etc. And we could read the rest of it there. But he appeals to his sense of flesh, of pride, and so on. So he does tempt us in our areas of weakness. 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 5. I think it's another example where Paul mentions here, and he looks at an area of weakness and says, be careful here. 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 5. In the context, Paul was talking about husbands and wives. And he is talking about, this is an adult class, he was talking about the fact that if you're not together sexually as a husband and wife, and you are separated for whatever reason, or you decide you're not going to be intimate for a time period, he's going to say you better be careful, lest Satan find this as a weakness, an opportunity to tempt you. But just read it. Defraud ye not one the other, except it be with consent, that is an agreement, for a time, that ye may give yourselves to fasting and prayer. If you're not going to involve yourselves in the intimacy of marriage, you've agreed not to, for whatever reason that may be, give yourselves to fasting and prayer and come together again. Why would he say that? Why would he say give yourselves to fasting and prayer? That Satan tempt you not for your incontinency. And that word means your lack of self-control. You've been together, you've enjoyed the intimacy that can come from this union. You decide you're not going to be intimate together. You better be giving yourself to fasting and prayer. Why? Well, you're going to be in a state of weakness. You're going to have desires, and that's what he says. Lest Satan tempt you not for your lack of self-control. He would use this as an opportunity to allure you into sin. So Paul certainly believed that Satan used knowing us as individuals, knowing our periods of weakness, and can use those things to destroy us through temptation. All right. I didn't give you much of a chance to talk. I was gone for a week, and I just let it all out. We'll start at number 5, and I'll make a note to make sure that I'm on pace here. That Satan knows and desires us as individuals, and we're going to look at some specific scriptures